I don't know if you had a chance, but there is some chicken soup on the way in. And so if you didn't get a cup of chicken soup, feel free to get up and grab a cup. The reason that we have this conversation sitting in a circle and a table, and it's reminiscent of a time when I know when I grew up down south, all the conversations happened at the kitchen table, and I used to be a fly on the wall child, where in my day when I was a kid in Tennessee, you didn't talk when grown folks was talking, you listened, and so I was raised in that way. I got when they finally let me at the big table, I still didn't do any talking because I had a lot of listening to do. So we want at the Boston Rising to have this conversation in our kitchen, because this is a kitchen table conversation. And in those kitchen table conversations, the truth comes out. Boston Rising has this concept called the rising class and what it means to be rising in America. Just to explain some of the context, we at Boston Rising believe that all of us are united in this idea that we want to live our lives in the best way that we can. Some of us have more resources. And so when you hear people on TV say that they're a self-made person, that they pulled themselves out on their bootstraps and they've made it, we understand that some of that may not be true, that there's a truth around how we rise together, and that ultimately every person in this country wants to live the best life that they possibly can. And whether you are wealthy, you are rising because you want to live your version of the American dream. And whether you are living in poverty, you are rising because you want to live your version of the American dream. And sometimes there are real obstacles that prevent us from living that American dream. One of the things that you didn't know, or some of that you might have known, when Boston Rising did, before we had staff, we had 2 years of where we had 6 or 7 fellows do research around what it means to make it in America. What are the things that the average American uses to live their American dream? And we discovered 3 truths about achieving the American dream. The first truth, most people were achieving their American dream through social connectivity. For some of us, it's been our mentors. For some of it, it's been that boss who gave you your first shot. For others, it's that guy in the neighborhood who took you to Little League for the first time. So our social connections have been one of the ways that most people have made it in America. The other way that most folks have made it in America is through their jobs. That first job you got at the grocery store packing groceries, the first time that you were mowing the grass in someone's lawn, someone gave you that first shot, that work-study job in the library that inspired you to read and become a writer. Our occupations have been one of the things that Americans have used to make it in America and to pursue their American dream. The other thing that most Americans have used to pursue their American dream has been education. Many of us have gone to school. I've heard that you can go to high school, graduate from high school, go to college and be someone, maybe get that job, work there for 20, 30 years and get that gold watch. Education was one of the tools that folks talked about as their tools for achieving the American dream. But we've discovered a truth about the American dream, particularly in communities of color, our communities. For most communities of color, education has not been a tool for rising. In Boston, we have a 55% graduation rate. So obviously, education is not a tool for rising in a school system that's 80% of color. It's no longer a tool. In Massachusetts, our unemployment rate is 8%. Nationally, it's 8.5%. And in our communities, it's over 30%. So obviously, in this economy and these times, jobs are not a tool for people to rise. So these are some of the truths. And in communities where there are high joblessness rates, high homelessness rates, and schools that are underperforming, the social connectivity that which binds us as neighborhoods is incredibly shattered. So these are the truths about rising in America. These are the truths that impact particularly communities of color in our city. And so in our monthly conversations about rising, we ask different leaders to come in and talk about their rising story. How did they make it? What are the words of wisdom for the 21st century? And how are we as Americans, young and old, who are all rising, trying to be our best selves, trying to reach scale? All of us want to be the best person that we can be. We try to go to the gym when we can. We try to take the vitamins that we're supposed to take, say our prayers. We try to be better siblings. We try to call our mama on Sunday if that's what we do. We try to be the best mother, father. We probably try to be the best parent we can be. We are trying to rise as people and citizens of this community. So what are the words of wisdom that we can get? So today I am fortunate that I have 2 phenomenal women, 2 phenomenal leaders here today to tell us some truth and do some truth telling about what we call rising. I think we have a lot of learning to do. We have a long history in this city. of truth-telling and a long history of the city of some lies, too. So I want to introduce our guest for today. And just to frame it a little bit further, my first 6 months at Boston Rising, I went on what I call this unofficial listening campaign. I'm a relatively young guy, so I figured I had a lot of listening to do. And I would say to myself as I was getting all this wisdom from some of the elders, some of my peers, and some of my friends who were telling me about their perspective, I wish there were other people here to hear what I'm hearing. Because if they heard what I heard, then maybe we can all learn something together. They could be these virtual flies on the wall. And so the idea of these rising conversations was that we can all be virtual flies on the wall. And not only can you be virtual flies on the wall, you have the opportunity to participate. This is not a one-sided dialogue. We are in a circle, so we can all participate. So I want to introduce our first guest, who really doesn't need any introduction in this town, and that's Sarah Ann Shaw. And I'm going to read just a short bio of some of the accomplishments in case some of you already didn't know. Mrs. Shaw is a part of many organizations right now, actively right now. Some of those include the St. Mark's Social Center, Boston Action Group, the Congress for Racial Equality, and she was also involved in the...
Oh, that's old.
That's old.
That is not current.
Well, some in our hearts. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Mrs. Shaw, as you may or not or may know, was a news reporter for WBZ for more than 30 years. She was a civil rights organizer and a human services advocate. She received many awards, including the Boston Radio Television, from the Boston Radio Television News Directors Association, a Lifetime Achievement Award, from the National Association of Black Journalists, the Yankee Quill Award from the New England Society of Newspaper Editors. She volunteers actively in the Boston Partners for Education. She's a board member for the Boston Neighborhood Network and currently serves as the president for both the Boston Coalition of Black Women and the League of Women for Community Service. Thank you, Ms. Shaw, for joining us today. Also with us is Bithiah Carter, who is currently the executive director of the Grand Circle Travel Foundation. Bithiah has a long history of service in our community, and some of the accomplishments, very short, abridged version of those accomplishments. She's the founder and president of the New England Blacks in Philanthropy. She was the former director of the United Way as the senior director of community impact. She was a director of the Girls Coalition of Greater Boston. But before she started in the human services work, she had a history in the financial sector, where she spent 10 years, I'm not trying to age you, sorry, 10 years in the financial services sector in both New York and Boston. Currently, Bithiah sits on the board of the Children's Museum, Room to Grow, Build, and the local board, and also in the advisory committee of the Green Light Fund. Let's put our hands together to welcome our two guests. So some of you are not, some of you are old to this conversation, have been coming to this conversation, and I'm just be honest with you. I have 5 questions that I try to answer, and I have not gone through all 5 questions in the last 4 conversations. They've been so rich and interactive. So I'm going to start off with the first question, but as we know, when you have kitchen cabinet and kitchen table conversations, you never get to the questions that you want to get to. You end up getting more and better questions than the ones that you had in your mind. So the first question that I want to ask our guests, I put a little bit of context about rising, what it means to rise in our community and rise in our city. And I'm wondering, can each of you share 1 or 2 moments, critical moments, where the idea of reaching your full potential, rising in Boston, were realized, some critical moments where they were some make or break moments that defined where you are today?
I chuckle because I can't think of an answer to your question, frankly. Boston is so very different now in many ways than it was when I was coming up. I went to Boston Public Schools 12 years, never had a black teacher. So my perception of the world was very different than that of which the children have nowadays. And so it's hard to say what was the pivotal moment. My pivotal moments were in my home, My father was what was called a race man. We had Pittsburgh Courier, we had the Afro-American, we had the Guardian, we had the Chronicle in our house, and we talked about, he always talked about race. He was a Southern man who migrated to Boston. So for me, you know, there's no pivotal moment. I can't say this happened, a button was pushed, and I've been active in community affairs for a long time, community activities, community groups, and along the way, I guess I met a lot of people, but I can't say that one person was much more important than the other. You know, but one thing I do want to say, when you do someone's bio, get it right. No, half the stuff in there was not correct. And I just want to say that.
So when I think about rising, unlike Sarah, I grew up in Cleveland, and it was a little bit different, I think, in the 70s and 80s. I was fortunate that I grew up in an all-black school with all-black teachers who had expectations. And I can remember even comic books that we read. They were about Sojourner Truth, or Ida B. Wells, or George Washington Carver. So you kind of grew up in this very insular sort of space, and you were prepared kind of for racism because you knew that there were other people that didn't like you.
Oh, you knew there was racism in Boston.
But I'm just saying you were prepared, but I don't think I was like truly prepared. That's where I'm going. Because I'm kind of insular and I'm in this really cocoon. And then all of a sudden in 4th grade, my parents moved, and we moved to the West Side. You know, that's a whole, like, whatever you want to call rising, or my parents thinking that this is a better neighborhood. And some ways yes, some ways no, many ways no. And I think I had a harsh introduction in 4th grade. I went to an all-white school, and I do think there was one thing that kind of shaped my outlook from then on. And I remember I had my little notebook, and it was a vocabulary. We had a reading group and a little notebook, and this woman gave me Mrs. Kubach gave me a B. And I couldn't figure out, why did I get a B? I should get an A. What's wrong? So I questioned her and said, why am I getting a B? I'm the only black child in a school of like 350 students, my class, 32 kids, and I'm standing there, and this woman proceeded to berate me over and over again. You people think you deserve this. You people, what grade do you deserve? And I thought, and as a, 4th grade, how old are you, 9? And I thought, what is happening to me? Because I'm raised to honor adults. You don't talk back. This is happening to me. It's embarrassing. I have more kids than this around me. And I thought, I don't know what grade I should receive. And I remember thinking, from now on, that will never happen to me again. I will know what I want. I'm going to articulate and get what I want. And I was very fortunate, to Sarah's point, to have parents that I could talk through this whole issue, but your parents aren't there in that moment. And they can prepare you for things, but there are points that you have to act. And that moment really was an eye-opener for me on race, because I don't have the protection of my parents, and I'm alone in this space. And I think the next moment is kind of like right now. I'm going to have a child soon. And so I'm really thinking about, what is this world I'm bringing my child into? And how are we shaping it? What are the images? One of the things Sarah Ann and I were talking about, what is rising? If I have white people, affluent white people like Tom Brokaw last night, talking about the fact that affluent whites are concerned about the fact that their children are not going to enjoy their standard of living, what is rising today? And then rising from what? When sometimes, and Sarah's probably going to talk about this, we don't even know what we're rising from. So how do we rise?
Yeah, I'd like to, you talk about the American dream. Do all people, particularly people that you're working with, Boston Rise, do they know what the American dream is? Or is it just day-to-day survival for many of those people? I mean, I brought a few things with me today, because I think that part of the issue, or problem, or whatever you want, is the lack of continuity in terms of addressing. I brought with me a document called The Freedom Movement in Boston by Noel Day, which was written in the 60s. And it talks about, it details the number of organizations that were working, particularly in Roxbury at that time, talks about the school boycott that happened to Boston, where 3,000 junior high and high school students didn't go to school because they went to a freedom school. Then there was the Power and Protest Civil Rights Movement in Boston from 1960 to 1968. It was a public symposium at the Kennedy Library, November 3rd and 4th, 2006. And last but not least, I have the document, Blacks in Boston, Massachusetts, A Policy and Political Agenda, Summer 1989, and has a list of people who were involved in developing this report, and you can see the thread of some of the things in 1960, 1989, and 2006 have really not changed that significantly, except maybe they get discussed a little bit differently, and new organizations have arisen to, no pun intended, have arisen to try to address them. But I don't know how much impact there has been, or how much intent there has been to take what has been done and try to analyze it. Did this work? Did this work? Did that work? What should we really do to really help people so they really become empowered to do for self, which is what we always use. Malcolm used to say, do for self, right, Sister Virginia?
So I think, to Sarah's point, even on this, here I am thinking that, okay, I've talked to Sarah and Shaw, picked her up many times. I don't even know these documents exist. And we're trying to start a New England Blacks in Philanthropy, another fit and start. So how do we build better continuity? How do we build an image of actually where do we want to be? I think the greatest thing that church has ever done, I don't care what church you're from, you have an image of heaven. Streets of gold, pearly gates, Peter, Paul, standing somewhere, God's going to say something. You have an image. You have something you're working towards. What is it we're working toward? And, you know, whether we look at this agenda or today's agenda, what's our image? And I think too often the image, and, you know, one of the things I think we're going to talk about later, the image of today is really like, it's okay. Those people are going to be poor. We're going to give them some palliative care, help them stay there, and not really have them believe in the image of tomorrow or what they could be. And I'm not sure sometimes if we fully believe. So how can we get there if we don't know where we've come from and not have that image of where we're going tomorrow?
You know, I think you make a point about getting information from our past, and how do we do this succession planning where generations pass on information, and you and I talk quite often. We've been friends and allies for years. What's the role for our generation, and this is really for anyone, what's the role for our generation to continue to get this information and to learn from this, and how do we come together with our elders to transfer information in this real sort of way?
Well, I think you find out that the information exists, A, and B, you look at it and you see what worked, what didn't work, what in something that happened in the past is really applicable today. Are we just spinning our wheels? Are we just replicating what's been done in the past? And what was the outcome of what was done before? I think that's one thing that would be helpful.
But I also...
Someone has...
Yes.
You know, one of the things that you raised, that you brought these documents with you, you and I are of an age where hard copy reports have meaning, have power, okay? I heard something really chilling that gave me real pause for thought recently, which was, there was a guy who said, you know, you realize that if a document isn't Googleable, it doesn't exist anymore.
That's right.
Okay? So those 4 reports, I'll bet you if I Google them, I'm not going to be able to find them when I go home. So I'm going to ask you, I mean, here, I'm a pragmatist, so I think those 4 documents that you selected are really important. If you selected them, okay, and there's continuity just in those 4 documents.
And I have a lot more at home.
Frankly, no, but those 4 that you picked are really interesting because you picked them to bring them to this conversation. I was going to say, could you guys post it on the Boston Rising site as PDFs?
Not my dear. I confess, I have no email address. I do nothing online. You know, and I'm not interested in learning how to do it, despite my grandchildren's.
But I'm saying Boston Rising is interested in cultivating continuity.
Right.
Those 4 documents should exist on the Boston Rising site
But see,
as a testimony to the fact that this conversation.
But it's more than just these 4 documents.
Yeah.
And so,
it's a
and
starting.
I think you're
It didn't really
absolutely...
exist, I didn't.
But to your
I want to read them.
But you knew, you were shaking your head, so something must have resonated with you when I was saying what they were.
I'm in Boston, Cambridge. I've lived in the Boston area for 22 years. We raised our kids here, okay? And I'm going to try and be contained.
You don't have to.
People know that I get extremely passionate. It's off-putting in Boston, Cambridge. You're supposed to be mannered. You're supposed to be polite. So I'm going to try and be mannered and polite. But I have seen an unraveling in the city and a trend toward mediocrity.
Right.
That is just profoundly disquieting.
Right.
Okay? I am struggling to find little loci, and I actually found one. I'm going to share this with the group. Okay? So I'm a member of Boston Rotary because I happen to believe that service above self is a really important ethos. Okay? I can buy into that. So we went to Pope John Paul II Academy, the Columbia campus. Okay? And we did a day of volunteering with the 8th graders. Now those 8th graders are really special 8th graders because when the schools got reorganized, they started as K through 5. These are the original 5th graders. So they're the first 6th graders, they're the first 7th graders, they're the first 8th graders, and now they're going to go off scatter all over the place to different high schools. We're talking Boston Latin, we're talking BC High. These kids are sharp. I walked in that room and after spending a day with them, they're a remarkable group of 28 8th graders. Okay? So I'm going to do everything I can to help offer them, I would convey these documents to them and say, this is the bedrock on which you are building, okay? Because I see among them a nascent community, okay? And it may only be 28 8th graders, but it's a starting point, okay? I don't see it where I live, frankly. I'm out in the burbs, I'm not going to badmouth my hometown, but I'm dismayed. I mean, anytime I say something about community and pulling and rising, it's just like cynicism and complacency, and that's not what I moved to the Boston area.
But isn't that because we did not really transmit the history of what has happened before to younger people? I mean, younger people, many they don't have a sense that life was not always Twitters and Tumblrs or whatever it is, they don't know, and they don't really understand that people really struggled so they can do some of the things that they can do. So.
That's not our family, actually. I mean,
But I'm not talking. I'm talking about in general.
well,
Yeah.
see, I think that overgeneralization is not helpful. I think it's finding those small loci of kids who really do get it and encouraging them to stay.
But I also think that most kids get it. They don't have the opportunity to receive it. And it's not just those special kids. I've been in many Boston public schools, and there are many special kids everywhere. And so what do we do? It goes back to what's the vision we're selling them? And, Imari, back to your question of how do we bring this together? Maybe we create a new mainstream. I think one of the things that the nonprofit has done, maybe, and I don't know because I wasn't here, it seemed like from what I've read from the 80s to the 90s, really tried to adopt a lot of business-like speak, attitudes, and also outcomes. And you can't, because your bottom line is society. Your bottom line isn't profit. And no matter how much we talk about a triple bottom line, people, profit, planet, blah, 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 you can't do that. So I become a little concerned when I talk to people and they're thinking, you know what? Businesses should help with schools or get more involved in schools. I don't know if I believe that, because that's the government's job to create a vibrant society, not train just new workers. So I think anger about this is fine, but what do we do with this anger? And how do we help transform whatever this mainstream idea is of profit equals rising or economy? If you have a lot of money and you're living in Wellesley, you have risen, even though you may be raping your daughter, beating up your wife, or have a horrible home, but you have risen because you live on the right street in Wellesley. We have to transform that idea and put forth a new idea that's based on something real.
Well, I think the idea of responsibility is very important. The second point you made, that pitting people made it in America through their first job or a good job. Many teenagers in Boston want to work. They want those jobs, but yet they see in the paper that this group is voting against funding summer jobs for kids, and they don't see lots and lots of corporations coming forward and saying, we're going to stop sending our jobs overseas, and we're going to bring low-level jobs here to Boston so you all can get a job. And a kid who wants a job, a young person who wants a job, has got to be discouraged to some degree when they see reports that summer jobs are going to be, collapse yet further, this year than they were last year, than they were the year before. I worked for the anti-poverty program. I worked there the first year they had a summer jobs program. They had never had one before. And we had no idea how to put a summer job program together. I was director of all the neighborhood operations for ABCD. And we spent hours till 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning trying to figure out where we were going to get the people to supervise the kids, where we were going to get the jobs for them to work in, et cetera, because we had no model. And we had thousands and thousands of jobs. Now you see that the jobs, closing. You said most people who made it, social connections. If you're in a certain place, maybe you can make social connections, but if you're not in that place, your social connections might not allow you to rise. It may not give you the kind of foundation that you need to build on. And we all need foundations to build on. So,
but also I think to your point, Sarah, it made me think about when you mentioned jobs. We've done this before. We created WPA for white males to rise. I mean, we know that. I thought it was very interesting.
but some blacks did.
Right, but here's where I'm going.
But the GI Bill.
The GI Bill.
The GI Bill is.
I'm going there next.
Yeah.
And I think that through that, I think, some people made it and moved forward. We also created financial avenues for people to take that first job and actually move into a different neighborhood, buy a home at X amount of dollars, let's say $32,000, like my mother-in-law, and now the home is worth $700,000, that they can build equity. We've also allowed GI bills and GI loans that start to have some disparity. So people didn't created some disparities that held people back. So we've had some real things happen. One of the things I thought was very interesting when President Obama, when he was first elected, tried to talk about something like a new WPA. People were against it. Oh my God, my taxes, my this, my that. I didn't hear nonprofits say a word about it. No one talks about, okay, you know what, this is about our people. How can we recreate that picture? For me, the same thing with healthcare. We are very quiet. We don't, except for the groups that are working in that field. How do we recreate this picture to help people understand you are being strangled by these costs, and this is strangling you and your community? And then lastly, to her point about jobs, jobs to where? People are working, but are they progressing? Are we really giving people the knowledge and critical thinking they need to not just think for a company, but think for themselves, be entrepreneurs? We come from a long line of entrepreneur people. Where's that today in our community? How do we reshape this rising community connectivity that really will work for people and their community, not just me coming in with a grant or coming in with my vision of what should happen and say, here you go, and here are the outcomes I want you to achieve for this year.
So, Ms. Shaw, you had mentioned Twitter and Tumblr and which are both technologies.
I mean, I read every day, so
How do we, as a community, take back our image? How do we, with more and more young people, and I read in a report the other day that the average amount of rollover minutes for phone companies has quadrupled in the last 10 years with the increased usage of text messaging. So we've increasingly become a society that relies on less and less physical interaction and more electronic interaction. And we get our information. We talked about if it's not on Google, it doesn't exist. We've become more and more a society that has access to information on one level, but more socially disconnected on another level in real connections. How do we control our image and regain our image in a society that way?
Well, I think unless you're able to stop the people who are profiting from it and make them be more responsible, it's not going to happen. I mean, it's not going to happen to me because I'm not going to do it. Because I want to talk to a person face to face and look in their eyes. I don't want to thumb them a message, you know? But I think that for people growing up, particularly, I think parents have to take a role. I think parents have to, when children are small, buying them. I have a great-grandson who's 6, who has a thing that he carries around with him all the time. And I said to his mother, take that thing away from him and give him a book, please, you know? But I'm old school and I know it, but that's who I am and that's who I'll be until I die, because I think that I think organizations need to take a stand and say something about the proliferation of the electronic, relationships versus the person-to-person relationship. I mean, you can learn a lot from people, and everyone said, well, it takes too much time. I can send an email, but then I hear from people, oh, I got 50 emails, and I looked, and I didn't know who some were from, and then some people I didn't want to talk to, so I deleted them. So, what have you gained? It may be fast, but have you gained anything?
I agree with Sarah. There's a lot of profit being made. I constantly think he that controls the image controls the mind.
Yeah.
So this is not just done, I think, in a vacuum. I think there's a lot of thought given to image and how things come together. My favorite show right now is Mad Men, and which really, to me, is kind of like it's not a sinister. I think it's kind of like the real look of how did we create the images that we believe in today. And then back to your point about manipulation. Parents have to have a role. I think needs to be more knowledge about social media. You just don't grow into knowing how to handle this. I think also manipulation to what end? And then where's our voice? I think in nonprofits and in philanthropy, we use it to our benefit. We constantly show the poor woman that's struggling, and she stands up and she makes a speech at our lunch thing or dinner thing, and you're cutting the chicken, and then she pauses because she's too nervous, and someone's standing next to her and they're pats her on the back, right? Her English is okay. It's going to be okay, and right. And I'm standing there next to you, Sarah, as you speak, and then I cry and people clap and they write a check. We benefit from it. And we have that over and over and over again. I know, because through Today's Girls, Tomorrow's Leaders, we would have women and say, this story isn't sad enough. Who else do you have? Because we're trying to make money on that same image. So if we are a part of this, and we're supposed to be the good people, the caring people, the people that are protecting everyone, what are we expecting from everyone else? I don't know. So when I think about this image piece, we profit from it, and we know we do. You go on most websites, go to most nonprofits' website, I can guarantee you 90% has a black child on it. Maybe biracial, now biracial, maybe Latino, but most time they're going to have a black child because people are going to look, they're going to feel bad, they're going to give money.
The one thing that I'm very concerned about is the lack of transference of the understanding of civics.
Right.
I mean, I've always been interested in politics. When I was working for Channel 4, I could not overtly be involved with politics. Now that I'm no longer there, I'm on the state Democratic Committee, I'm on my ward committee, etc. And I think it's very, very important that people understand how the political process works in this country, and most people have no sense at all. I talk to people about going to caucus where they're electing delegates to go to, the convention in Charlotte, or going to the state convention. They say, well, what's the caucus for? When I ask people, who's your state rep, who's your state senator, who's your representative in Congress, who's your U.S. senator, many people don't know that, and that's just sort of basic knowledge you ought to know. So and who's your city council? Because if you want to appeal to someone about something that the government is doing, something that's wrong in your neighborhood, you at least should know the name of who that person is so you can call them up as a citizen and know that you're entitled. But people don't think oh, they think the government, either they think the government's too big, or it doesn't work, or they know so little about it that they don't understand. We elect these people to be in office. Our election enables them to have a salary. And if you don't try to hold their feet to the fire, then we get these loggerheads in Congress, because people who have voted for someone who votes against their interests, they say, oh, I'm not happy, I'm not happy. You got to get in there and do something about it. That's also so.
Sarah, may I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Of course, miss.
My question is, I heard you earlier speaking about the lack of transferring of knowledge, which is really critical in our community because we have not, for whatever reason, been able to do it. But when you mentioned civics, and I think in terms of when you and I were going to school, of course we had civics in our class. But I venture to say, and we're talking about Boston Rising, in every single solitary urban community across this country, the same type of lack of education, miseducation, whatever you want to call it, is taking place. We're talking about Boston Rising, and of course, you're focusing on the least, and of course, the least happen to be me and us and those who look like me, etc. So, why is it that civics, has been taken out of the public school system, which impacts us, but not out of the suburban school system? The other thing that I understand that one of our Boston City Councils, is now going to introduce, to be discussed, Black history to become part of the core curriculum for the Boston Public School System, which is wonderful when we think in terms of, and it's wonderful not just for people of color, but for all
people to know,
groups of people, because for whatever reason, when Europeans, when they're in school, their school system is certainly more advanced than ours is today, which puts us at a disadvantage. When we come through school and we go to apply for a job, okay, we're at a disadvantage there. Unfortunately, I'm saying generally, certainly not all of us. And then if we get the job, we go into the corporate and we try to climb the corporate ladder. There's that invisible glass ceiling, and those who are sitting at the table generally don't look like us. So if we go into, say, medicine, and we look at the surgeons and the nurses, generally they don't look, the majority, I'm saying, don't look like, even in the legal system, the majority of the judges, etc. So I see an immediate problem that deals with self-pride and self-esteem. So how do we now, someone like me who has a loud voice, and I talk a lot about how, and we know the statistics, okay? There's been enough studies, enough surveys. Everybody in this room knows what the problem is with regards to the community of color generally. Okay, so we know what the problem is. Education is paramount. And you go around this room, education. So we have to look at, from dealing with preschool, really not even preschool. Let's go back to, you were talking about parents, parenting skills. You know, what are our young people, what are they taking in? What are they eating? What are they eating? What is it that is impacting the way our children come out and are born, and how they're acting? Their education is paramount to bringing up any society. So we're talking about genuinely wanting to do something so that there's equality of education, housing, jobs, etc., 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 health. Then it starts with education. So what are we going to do collectively, you know, to help the least. And it takes human resources, and it takes capital resources. So how do we, and what is it that we do to make those two things happen?
And Sister Virginia, it's also an understanding that these things are, that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You need to understand the basics that need to be accomplished. But we seem to reinvent the wheel. Here we go. Let's try this, let's try that. It's sort of like trial and error in many, many instances.
But I want to go back to your point about civics, because I think civics is very important. When I couldn't believe this, no one was taught civics here. I thought people were lying to me, so I started asking kids. I think it's about disempowerment, and once you disempower people, you can control what you do through policy, because it doesn't matter. I'm not going to question what you do in my community. I'm not going to question that, because to Sarah Ann's point, government's too big, too small. I don't understand it because I don't even know how it works. I listened to Tom Brokaw yesterday at Symphony Hall, and you have even that population talking about politics as being controlled by a very narrow few. Very narrow interests, whether it's Green, whether it's Tea Party, whether it's whomever, but it's very narrow. And the rest of the people are being left out of that conversation, and I think their children are being left out of that conversation. And so therefore, it's easier to control people.
Exactly.
Now you eat what I tell you to eat. You don't question what the dye is. You don't question how it's grown. You don't question anything because you don't even know how to question it. So I think, going to your point about education, why aren't we more angry about education? Education, I don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, whatever you are, it's about national security. It's about our
terrorism.
National security, but also it's about each and every one of us being able to prosper. And if you don't believe that, then look at the tigers from 1960s, when you look at Korea, China, look at those nations. They're educating their population, and we're complacent, again, to act like, I think even the nonprofits, corporations, because maybe we'll grow overseas. Maybe we see profit someplace else. We're not looking at our own people as assets. I think that's the main problem. And the asset that I can see you becoming, because now you're kind of dumb and poor and you're in this community, maybe I can sell you some chewing gum. Maybe I can sell you more popcorn. Maybe I can sell you more of this from that little tiny check that you received. But we collectively are not thinking about why are we collectively not becoming angry? We're not really thinking about our future.
I think sometimes you have to have a real focus, a point that something just makes you go off. Like the civil rights movement, people knew they knew racism was rampant. And so people said, we're going to really try to do something about it. And some things did change, but there wasn't the follow-through, there wasn't the transference of information, there wasn't the holding of people's feet to the fire to make sure that things that were said actually implemented. I was very, frankly, optimistic when the Occupy people came out. I said, oh, maybe they'll start to steer the conversation in a way where people will understand that there is a 99% and a 1%. But because they didn't, their message wasn't, it was too obtuse in some ways for people, and they were seen as hippies, which is the old pejorative image, the pejorative, they were seen as hippies. Even though there's some pockets of them still trying to do things, I think the movement, I'd be surprised if it resurrects itself to the extent that it was when it first started. You had a question, then him. See, I can't help it.
I was trying to.
I can't help it.
Well, you actually took it to the place where I was going, which was, I heard you mention two things that it's about, but I really kept thinking in my mind, and I worry I sometimes oversimplify. But the third thing for me is really a sense of outrage.
Right.
And I often, and Shaw, you just mentioned sort of that pinnacle moment, and I think about actually walking into a meeting about violence, in the city, and it was actually it happened to be a street safe meeting with donors and all of these women, so we're sitting around, we're trying to figure out, how do you convey this this is a crisis. And I happened to walk into that meeting that day having just had to take out a life insurance policy on my 3-year-old because I live in the zone on the map that they had on the wall that talked about where children were getting killed randomly. I mean, he's not, you know, ever going to be that child that is deliberately in a situation where that should be what the expectation is. And yet I was outraged that I had to think about, okay, you know, that makes no sense. And I thought about it, I thought, if I lived in Wellesley, if I lived in Newton, if I lived in a community where that's not tolerated, then I wouldn't, you know, even be in this situation. And so then I was sitting here thinking also about my 7-year-old who really does simplify it when I think about what the process is and what I feel like I had growing up, and you know, you had it, what our parents, you know, my parents worked with you, and they were outraged about, you know, the lack of opportunities and the they demanded things. So it went from outrage to having a way to activate upon that outrage. And I think if you don't have that opportunity to activate, you become depressed, right? And so you need that outlet. And I think about my son Gary, who the cycle for him is he constantly wants to be exposed, right? So I expose him to things all of the time. But once he's exposed, then he wants access. And so I have to give him that access. And sometimes I can't, right? And if I can't, he becomes outraged.
Right.
Because he wants to know why. Why can't I have that? Now, and as many possible ways as I can, he will have access. And we'll create that for him. But is it that, am I oversimplifying is my question for you. Is it that simple? Because I understand education plays a role and families play a role, but if I'm a parent and I don't even understand that there's that very clear cycle of exposure to what? Access? I don't have access. What are the options?
Then why would you ask why?
Even if I get the options, can I make them come true?
Right.
So.
But I don't know, as you were talking, I had a thought. I was thinking about the conditions that created the activists who then executed on that outrage, right? And you're really talking about veterans of World War II, their children being the activists. So there was a certain amount of mental exercising that took place, right? That folks got their training from World War II, and they had families and they had children, and these children demanded and therefore exercised that demand through outrage, right? And so I am a child of one of those folks who couldn't drink out of a water fountain that was out there exercising their outrage. So we are that generation. So I'm wondering, I think the conditions for the outrage is there, right? We don't live in a post-racial America, but what are the conditions, the exercises, the training that actually prevent us, or lack of, that prevent us from exercising that outrage of our generation?
Or maybe even why is it acceptable? Like, why is it okay?
Why is it okay for us that we're not exercising that outrage? What's happened?
I think media plays a role. I think media plays a definite role when you see commercials that accept certain living conditions. When you hear music that's very degrading, but you're hearing it over and over and over and over again. You know, you're watching shows on television, folks who are for whatever reason unemployed and they have the boob tube on, and I think media
And manners. I mean, I am amazed sometimes when I read the paper about things people are writing about other people anonymously on the internet or wherever they write it, these blogs and stuff. You know, listen, people used to have manners. You respected people and you acted with respect. And now anything goes and no one says, wait a minute, stop it. That is enough. No, you can't do that. You can't. Free speech notwithstanding, there are rules. You know, there are rules about how you treat people, and if you don't treat people nicely, something's going to come back and bite you.
But to your point about the media, I think the media plays a big role. You know, and I think about hip hop a lot and celebrating poverty in a lot of ways. I think about, I brought a newspaper because, constantly we see this kind of image of us, black women, okay, I'm gonna say us as in me, in the newspaper. I've not seen that picture of the white guy that killed a woman in Southie yet, a picture like this. I think it goes back to what we, watch on television, what is it, reality TV, of this is the way you're supposed to act. I think people are caught up in their own individual rage of what they think they should have, but I don't think that collectiveness is celebrated, shown. We talk about it even in nonprofits, and we are pitted against each other. We don't share knowledge. We don't share anything in the nonprofits. And the foundations are even worse. We don't share. And then I think for the people that we are supposedly trying to help, we see ourselves as different than them, because I drive a Volvo and I live here, so I'm not really them. I'm kind of them when I drive through there, but I'm not really them. And I think there is that us and them.
Classism.
Exactly, classism that comes into play. I think the new racism is very subtle. That comes into play as well, and we're not willing to have a collective conversation about it because it's not polite. It's not okay to be upset. So how many times have we heard that piece? This way, okay, I'm upset. Okay, what do you do? That was a nice conversation. Okay, let's move on. Sorry.
I just want to say something, Sister Virginia. You talk about the media. People think I can't do anything, but they don't complain. But yet you'll see I remember seeing there was a small group in Florida who didn't like the fact that there was a show being broadcast about Muslims, and Coles, the people who do lumber and all that. They said, "Oh no, we're pulling our responses." But I don't often see that kind of response coming from other people who are affronted by things that happen.
But you have to know civics, and you have to know you're empowered to do
but
those things.
There are people who do know. I mean, I call the media, I call the Globe
But
frequently
Sarah,
and leave my name.
how many people actually talk about
They
the
don't talk.
purchasing power
Right. It's
of
an economic
people of
thing.
color? If you say to someone, everyone else knows that people of color are a nation of consumers.
Yeah.
We buy. You can come in our community and try to and
Sell us an elephant.
any widget. I don't care.
Sell us an
We
elephant.
will purchase it. Okay? So if there are enough people saying, hey, you guys, meaning us, you guys spend somewhere around $873 billion a year. And do you know that if you globally think in terms of maybe the 9th, 10th or largest country in their gross national product, they don't spend that much, or they spend that, and they're a nation, running a nation, a country. So you have purchasing power. If you don't like something, then there was a guy, there was an attorney, sorry.
But people are afraid to lose.
Warren Ballantyne.
Yeah. People are afraid to lose, that they may lose what they have.
But people do know this, and that's why Ashley Stewart knows. What's the green box of cigarettes? No, Newport, they know. There are people.
But the average person, the person that we're trying
to help.
Okay.
But I think that comes back to whether it's education at home, civics, or whatever, that you have to understand your power. And even when you understand it, what do you do with it?
Yeah,
Who do you call? How do you want to do something? You Google that CEO. I had a problem with Tiffany's. So went into Tiffany's, make a long story short, they didn't want to sell me what they wanted to sell me. I came home, I wrote the CEO, sent the letter off to New York. Next thing, I have a personal shopper. Oh, we took all of that off your bill because we don't want to be seen as racist. Oh my God, we really apologize. That will never happen. I bought $900 worth of stuff gone off my American Express because they don't want that image. You're right. But what if I didn't know to do that?
Exactly.
So how do we empower people and teach them? And that's all of our roles.
Yes,
So,
it is.
so Tony,
So
you,
Tony.
you say one more thing, and
Yeah,
then
one thing that resonated with me is social connections and also transfer of knowledge. So with youth specifically. So last night I had about 20 youth from Roxbury, and we watched The Rising Class with Mel King and Hubie. Traditionally, there were probably kids in that room watching it who would never come downtown and be here. And to ask them, what does it mean for you to rise, and what is your American dream? And social connections is huge, and a lot of times in my household, I had stories from the civil rights era and things like that passed down to me, but there's no middleman between that and these youth. And I tell them all the time, and it seems pretty corny, that youth are literally our future. And I say to them a lot, like, you're our future, but that's literal. And a lot of them aren't in the space to make the social connections to achieve success. And when we start drilling down and figure out what does it mean for you to rise up? And a lot of things, buying power and a lot of things that we go over, it's the social connections. We went over the list from, they had the top 50 powerful people in Boston, and Ayanna Pressley and Deval Patrick, both of them are political people.
Right.
In their eyes, they're like, in order for me to be powerful, I have to be political. And it's interesting because they feel that if they're in a space and they have the connections, then that's, in a way, that might be their only way to be powerful. But they're not in different circles. They're not in finance circle, and they're not in
legal circles, or even media circles.
They're not in a lot of the circles that there should be, and there's
or
not.
they
don't even know about them. And let's talk about Ayanna and Deval, who both have, what's the power behind them? Barbara Lee and other people, and Larry Fish, that actually says, okay, you know what, I do like you, so here's some money. And I'm going to buy this candidate over here. So how do we, to your point, not only transfer that, but broaden the spectrum and broaden their ability to see themselves in these spaces?
And how do we approach them and make them understand that it can apply to them without appearing condescending? Let me tell you something,
right?
Boy, let me wise you up a little bit. You've got to figure out some new ways of approaching not just young people, but their parents. Or the adult who raises them, because many of our children are not being raised by parents. I'm amazed at the number of children in the Boston public school system who live on their own, who have a room someplace, and that was unheard of when you lived at home. That's where you lived.
But we can't rise if you really have the bigotry of low expectations, that we really don't expect people to rise. And that's part of the transfer. Well, why am I transferring knowledge to you if you don't need it or you don't have it? So why we don't demand it in schools? We don't demand it of ourselves, because I think there's some level of the bigotry of low expectations.
So whenever the conversation is getting started, I'm getting the evil eye from Brittany, meaning that our time is running out. I appreciate it.
Does anyone have a burning question?
I guess I do.
Yeah. Sorry to hijack. I can't help being who I am. I did it for 31 years. I
got a fan. I got a fan of fire.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure, but I feel like I'm the youngest person in the room. I might be. I'm not going to say how old I am. But I feel like a lot of the conversation is talking about young people and not telling us, and I've been to a bunch of different series, conversations about Black politics, Black class, stuff like that. But I never hear, what do you think we should do? I always hear, what's the problems? But I never hear, all right, well, since you're younger, I recommend X, Y, Z. It's always, here's the problem, and we have a problem. But there's no suggestion.
So what would you suggest, that instead of me and Bithiah, there should be two 18-year-olds and 16-year-olds? No, I'm not. I'm saying this. I'm honestly sitting here talking about what they see as the problem and how, and having a conversation about what they think might make a difference.
Or are you asking?
Let her answer first, Bithiah.
No, I want to clarify her question.
No.
Are you asking? No, I want to understand her question. So are you asking what is? I need to clarify. So are you asking what are we saying should be done, or
It's
you
like,
should
what
be
are your
sitting here?
suggestions
Right,
Yes.
for
what are your
me?
suggestions?
And I think that's a good, if I
Right.
could paraphrase what you're saying, because I think I heard what you're saying too. How do we get to solution space?
I
And
think
so
that-
we've had great conversations around
I think we
identifying
can
what's here.
suggest things
And so
throughout the
maybe
conversation.
That's where I'm going.
if the two of you, and I think there's also a good suggestion around how we could frame a conversation. But is there maybe one or two things so we could leave the conversation in solution space that you would recommend as we close this conversation?
Well, I was trying through what I was saying to give some examples of things I thought might help. I mean, maybe I didn't, maybe I wasn't clear enough, but I think that we ought to interact. We ought to get people to understand more about civics, how it impacts their lives. We need to really, and I think that nonprofits that are working with people need to do more to encourage them and to educate them about what is possible. Honey, I haven't been a teenager for a long, long time, or a 20-year-old for a long time. So I really don't know what's that applicable. All I can do is say what my common sense tells me might help.
I think, and I've been thinking a lot about this because I feel like I'm somewhere in the middle, and I think there's fits and starts in trying to create intergenerational learning, and it's not really taken off. Like, one of the things, I'm so happy she talked to me about these documents, because now I'm going to read them and try to figure out what does that mean going forward. So I think there has to be a level of self-education, and I think we have to do a better job of just do more ourselves. We can't wait for someone to say, hey, this is the right thing to do. And I don't know how best to say that, whether it's education, whether it is our own community. I think we've gotten used to white people coming in and saving us. I don't know when did that start or how it happened, that we are not having enough communication among ourselves to set our own vision of what we think should be for us in the future. I constantly think about my great-great-great-grandmother came out of slavery, and they created communities, and they put people through college. Who gave them that vision? Where did it come from? They created it themselves and then worked toward it. I feel like somehow we are getting wrapped up in someone else telling us what to do instead of us creating our own vision, intergenerational vision, and moving towards that. And that's the thing that I'm going to try to work on.
Thank you all for coming today for a wonderful conversation. Next month, we actually have two conversations for next month. Our first conversation is Ron Dorsey from BAR, who's talking to Robert Lewis Jr. from Boston Foundation, and so that'll happen in early May. And in late May, we have Claudio Martinez and Vanessa Rosario from IBA. And this is an all Spanish conversation, and so for those of you who do not speak Spanish, there will be headphones available for you to join the conversation in Spanish. Thank you all for coming today, and have a great and wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you.
You're going
Thank you.
to translate the